The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo de' Medici reviewed the latest intelligence reports from his network of spies. The year was 1513, and Florence trembled on the precipice of chaos. French armies marched south while Spanish forces consolidated their hold on Naples. The Pope's allegiances shifted like sand in the desert wind, and the very survival of the Republic hung by threads spun from political cunning and raw ambition. In a modest apartment near the city's edge, a man of 44 years sat hunched over his writing desk, his quill scratching furiously across parchment. Niccolò Machiavelli, once secretary of the Second Chancery, now found himself stripped of office, banned from the palazzo, and reduced to observing the deadly game of politics from the outside. Yet perhaps this vantage point offered the clearest view of all. The flames in his fireplace flickered as he paused, considering the weight of what he was about to commit to paper. These were not merely observations about governance or philosophical musings about the nature of man. These were the cold, unvarnishing truths that separated those who merely played at power from those who truly understood its essence. They were the principles that could sharpen a mind to such a keen edge that it could slice through the elaborate deceptions and noble pretenses that clouded lesser intellects. The first truth, men judge more by eyes than hands. The crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria erupted in thunderous applause as the newly appointed Gonfalonier raised his hand in acknowledgement. His robes, embroidered with golden thread and lined with ermine, caught the afternoon light magnificently. His retinue, carefully selected for their imposing stature and gleaming armor, flanked him in perfect formation. Every gesture had been choreographed, every word rehearsed until it flowed like honey from his tongue. Yet Machiavelli knew, as did any observer possessed of true insight, that this man's actual qualifications for leadership were questionable at best. He had inherited his wealth rather than earned it, stumbled through several minor administrative posts through family connections, and possessed all the strategic vision of a merchant counting coins. But he looked the part of a leader, and, in the theater of politics, appearance often mattered more than substance. This was the first and, perhaps most fundamental truth that Machiavelli had observed. The vast majority of people judge by what they see rather than by what they can verify through direct experience. The common man, pressed by the demands of daily survival, lacks both the time and the inclination to investigate the true character of those who would lead him. He sees the magnificent palace, the costly garments, the confident bearing, and he assumes these outward signs reflect inner virtues. The shrewd operator understands this weakness in human nature and exploits it ruthlessly. He invests heavily in the construction of his public image, knowing that a well-crafted persona can substitute for actual competence in most situations. The incompetent prince who maintains the appearance of strength and wisdom can often retain power longer than the capable ruler who fails to project these qualities convincingly. Consider how Ferdinand of Aragon had managed to transform himself from a minor regional monarch into one of Europe's most feared rulers. His military victories were significant but not unprecedented. His administrative reforms were competent but hardly revolutionary. What set him apart was his genius for spectacle and symbolism. When he expelled the Moors from Granada, he did not simply complete a military campaign, he staged a grand religious crusade that captured the imagination of all Christendom. When he married Isabella of Castile, he did not merely secure a political alliance, he created the image of a divine union blessed by God himself. Every public appearance was calculated to reinforce his image as God's chosen instrument on earth. His court was organized to display his magnificence. His religious devotions were performed where they would be most visible. Even his private quarters were designed to impress the occasional visitor who might glimpse them. He understood that ruling required not just the exercise of power, but the performance of power. This principle extended far beyond the realm of high politics. In the workshops of Florence, Machiavelli had observed how the most successful artisans were not always the most skilled craftsmen, but those who best understood the importance of presentation. The goldsmith who displayed his wares in an elegant shop with fine lighting would command higher prices than his competitor working in a cramped, poorly lit stall, even if their actual skills were comparable. The merchant who dressed well and spoke eloquently could often negotiate better terms than one who appeared shabby, regardless of the quality of his goods. The implications were profound and disturbing. If perception could so easily substitute for reality, then those who mastered the arts of illusion held tremendous advantages over those who focused solely on developing genuine competence. The world was not a meritocracy where virtue and ability naturally rose to the top, but a stage where the best actors often claimed the leading roles. Yet this truth, properly understood, need not lead to despair or cynicism. For the intelligent observer, it provided a crucial advantage. While others remained deceived by surface appearances, he could look deeper, evaluating people and situations based on their true merits rather than their superficial qualities. He could avoid the trap of being impressed by empty displays of wealth or status, focusing instead on indicators of actual capability and character. More importantly, he could use this knowledge strategically. Understanding that most people judged by appearances, he could craft his own presentation to maximum effect. This did not necessarily require deception or dishonesty, it simply meant ensuring that his genuine qualities were displayed in the most favorable light possible. The virtuous man who appeared virtuous would have advantages over the virtuous man who appeared common or unremarkable. The second truth, the lion and the fox. The Duke of Valentino's, Cesare Borgia, stood before the map of central Italy, his finger tracing the boundaries of territories that were not yet his but soon would be. His captains surrounded him, each representing a different facet of power. There was Vitellozzo Vitelli, master of artillery; Oliverado da Fermo, skilled in sudden violence; Paolo Orsini, bringing the weight of an ancient name; and Liberato, whose cruelty was matched only by his effectiveness. Machiavelli, present as an envoy from Florence, watched with fascination as Cesare orchestrated what would become known as the masterpiece of Senigallia. Here was a demonstration of the second fundamental truth, that effective leadership required the ability to be both lion and fox, to combine force with cunning, strength with deception. The Duke's problem was elegantly simple yet fiendishly complex. His captains had served him well in his conquests, but they were becoming too powerful, too independent. Each controlled significant forces and territories. Each harbored ambitions that might conflict with his own. Collectively, they represented a threat to his authority that could not be ignored. Yet they were also experienced commanders whose services he still needed. A direct confrontation would be costly and uncertain. Something more subtle was required. Cesare began by publicly expressing concern about the loyalty of some of his captains while privately reassuring each of them individually about his continued trust and favor. He leaked information suggesting that he suspected certain conspiracies while simultaneously providing each captain with intelligence about the supposed disloyalty of the others. Like a master musician playing multiple instruments, he orchestrated a symphony of suspicion and mistrust. The beauty of his strategy lay in its indirection. Rather than moving against his captains himself, he created conditions where they would move against each other. When Vitellozzo and Oliverado finally succumbed to their fears and began plotting against their master, they were merely dancing to a tune he had composed. When they reached out to Paolo Orsini and others seeking allies for their rebellion, they were walking into a trap that had been months in the making. The culmination at Senigallia was a masterwork of deception. Cesare invited his captains to a conference, ostensibly to plan their next campaign. He presented himself as the generous leader, concerned only with their collective success. He praised their past service and outlined ambitious plans for future conquests. When they lowered their guard, convinced of his good intentions, he struck with the sudden violence of the lion. In a single evening, he eliminated his most dangerous subordinates without the risks and costs of a prolonged conflict. Those who witnessed the event spoke of it with a mixture of horror and admiration. Here was power exercised with surgical precision, achieving maximum effect with minimal effort. But the lesson extended far beyond this particular historical moment. Cesare's success demonstrated a fundamental principle about the nature of effective action in a complex world. Pure force, no matter how overwhelming, was often insufficient to achieve one's goals. The commander who relied solely on the lion's approach, direct confrontation, intimidation, brute strength, would find himself repeatedly frustrated by obstacles that could not simply be battered down. Consider the fate of Charles VIII of France, who had swept into Italy with overwhelming military force, conquering city after city with remarkable ease. His armies were larger, better equipped, and more professional than anything the Italian states could field individually. Yet within 2 years, he found himself forced to retreat, his conquests evaporating like morning mist. His mistake was believing that military superiority alone would be sufficient to hold what force had won. The successful operator understood that some obstacles required cunning rather than strength. The fortress that could not be taken by assault might be captured through infiltration. The enemy who could not be defeated in open battle might be neutralized through political maneuvering. The rival who could not be overcome through competition might be eliminated through strategic alliance building. Equally important was recognizing when the fox's methods had reached their limits. Deception and manipulation could achieve remarkable results, but they required time to work and could be disrupted by unexpected developments. When circumstances demanded immediate action, when enemies were already mobilized and committed, when the moment for subtlety had passed, then the lion's approach became necessary. The Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, had been a master of the fox's arts, weaving elaborate webs of alliance and counter-alliance, playing French interests against Spanish, papal against imperial. His diplomatic maneuvers had been works of art, keeping much larger powers in balance while he pursued his own agenda. But, when the crisis finally came, when Louis XII committed his full resources to the conquest of Milan, all of Ludovico's cunning proved insufficient. The moment demanded the lion's strength, and he lacked the military power to resist effectively. The third aspect of this truth was perhaps the most subtle, knowing which approach to use in any given situation, and, more importantly, how to combine them effectively. The greatest practitioners were those who could seamlessly shift between fox and lion as circumstances required, sometimes even employing both approaches simultaneously. Frederick Barbarossa had demonstrated this principle during his Italian campaigns. When facing the Lombard League, he had combined massive military pressure with sophisticated diplomatic efforts to split the alliance. He negotiated separately with individual cities while his armies remained poised to strike. He offered generous terms to those who submitted while making examples of those who resisted. Each approach reinforced the other. His military strength made his diplomatic offers more attractive, while his diplomatic successes weakened his enemies' will to resist militarily. The third truth, fear versus love, the calculation of hearts. The execution took place at dawn in the central square of Rimini, attended by a crowd that had gathered in sullen silence. Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, Lord of Rimini, stood on the platform watching as his former treasurer paid the ultimate price for embezzling funds from the city's coffers. The man had served faithfully for over a decade before succumbing to temptation, and his family had pleaded for mercy, offering to make full restitution. But Malatesta had refused all appeals. As the axe fell, Machiavelli reflected on what he was witnessing, a perfect illustration of the third fundamental truth about power and human nature. It was better to be feared than loved, if one had to choose between them, because love depended on the goodwill of others while fear depended on one's own actions. The reasoning was as logical as it was cold. Love was a fickle emotion, dependent on circumstances beyond one's control. The subjects who loved their prince today might withdraw that affection tomorrow if conditions changed, if a rival offered them better terms, or simply if their own interests shifted. Love was something that could be withdrawn at will, making it an unreliable foundation for authority. Fear, by contrast, was under the prince's direct control. Through consistent application of punishment for transgression and reward for compliance, a ruler could create a predictable environment where subjects understood the consequences of their choices. Fear was not dependent on the subject's emotional state or their assessment of alternative options, it was based on their rational calculation of likely outcomes. But Machiavelli's analysis went deeper than this simple preference for fear over love. He understood that the ideal situation was to be both feared and loved, combining the reliability of fear with the enthusiasm and voluntary cooperation that love could inspire. The challenge lay in achieving this combination without allowing one element to undermine the other. The greatest rulers had managed this delicate balance by creating a clear distinction between their public and private personas. In their official capacity, they were inexorable forces of justice who punished wrongdoing without regard for personal feelings. But they also found ways to demonstrate genuine care for their subjects' welfare, showing mercy when it would not undermine their authority and providing benefits that improved people's lives. Consider the example of Louis XI of France, known to his contemporaries as the Spider King for his web of spies and informants. His methods were often ruthless, and he showed no hesitation in eliminating threats to his authority. Yet he also worked tirelessly to strengthen France's economy, promote trade, and improve the lives of ordinary citizens. He was feared by his enemies and potential rivals, but loved by merchants and craftsmen who prospered under his protection. The key insight was that fear and love operated in different spheres and served different purposes. Fear maintained order and prevented open rebellion, but it could not inspire the kind of enthusiastic cooperation and personal sacrifice that love could generate. A purely fear-based regime might achieve stability, but it would remain brittle and inefficient. Subjects would comply with orders but would not go beyond the minimum required, would not offer creative suggestions, would not take initiative in advancing the ruler's interests. Love, on the other hand, could inspire remarkable devotion and effort, but it provided no reliable mechanism for maintaining discipline or dealing with those whose interests conflicted with the ruler's goals. The beloved leader who could not credibly threaten punishment would find himself constantly tested and undermined by those who calculated that they could transgress without serious consequences. The morning execution in Rimini demonstrated another crucial aspect of this principle: the importance of consistency in the application of fear. Malatesta's treasurer had embezzled money, and, regardless of his previous service or family circumstances, he had to face the prescribed consequences. To show mercy in this case would have sent a dangerous message to other potential transgressors, that long service could purchase indulgence, that personal appeals might override justice, that the laws applied differently to different people. By contrast, Malatesta's approach to rewarding loyal service was generous and public. He regularly promoted capable subordinates, granted bonuses for exceptional performance, and made sure that good service was recognized and celebrated. His subjects understood that while transgression would be punished severely, loyalty and competence would be rewarded handsomely. This created what modern observers might recognize as a highly effective incentive structure. People knew exactly what was expected of them and what consequences they could expect for their choices. The uncertainty that plagued many regimes, where subjects never knew whether their actions would be rewarded, punished, or ignored, was eliminated through clear and consistent policies. The emotional dimension of this truth was equally important. Machiavelli recognized that humans were fundamentally self-interested creatures who made decisions based on their assessment of personal costs and benefits. Love might inspire temporary sacrifice, but it could not sustain long-term loyalty when it conflicted with self-interest. Fear, properly applied, aligned subjects' self-interest with the ruler's commands, creating a more stable and predictable foundation for governance. Yet the application of this principle required considerable sophistication. Fear that was excessive or arbitrary could provoke desperate resistance. Subjects who believed they had nothing to lose might choose rebellion over submission, calculating that even a hopeless struggle was preferable to certain destruction. The art lay in calibrating fear precisely, making it sufficient to deter transgression without making it so oppressive that it inspired desperation. Similarly, the cultivation of love had to be genuine and substantial. Empty gestures and hollow promises would quickly be recognized as such, potentially creating greater resentment than if no attempt at benevolence had been made. Subjects who felt manipulated or deceived by false displays of affection might become more dangerous than those who simply accepted their ruler's indifference. Part 2: The Mechanisms of Influence. The fourth truth: the art of controlled perception. In the antechamber of the papal apartments, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere waited with barely concealed impatience. The morning's audience with Pope Alexander VI would determine whether his long exile would finally end, whether his family's fortunes would be restored, whether his own ambitions could at last be pursued openly. Yet he was acutely aware that his fate hung not on the merits of his case, but on his ability to manage the impression he created in the crucial minutes ahead. This scene, replayed countless times in courts across Europe, illustrated the fourth fundamental truth that Machiavelli had observed: the supreme importance of controlling not just what people knew, but how they interpreted what they knew. Information itself was neutral, its power lay entirely in how it was perceived and understood by those who received it. The cardinal's challenge was instructive. His years in exile had been the result of opposing the Borgia Pope's policies, and Alexander had good reason to view him as a potential threat. Simply presenting facts about his loyalty or qualifications would be insufficient. Such facts could easily be interpreted in ways that confirmed existing suspicions rather than alleviating them. Instead, he needed to create a framework for interpretation that would lead the Pope to the desired conclusions. As the cardinal entered the papal presence, he immediately prostrated himself in a display of submission that went beyond mere protocol. His words, when he was permitted to speak, emphasized not his own merits but his recognition of the Pope's wisdom and authority. He framed his request for restoration not as something he deserved, but as an opportunity for Alexander to demonstrate the magnanimity that had made him such a successful pontiff. Every element of his presentation was designed to make acceptance feel like the natural and obvious choice. This manipulation of interpretive frameworks was perhaps the most sophisticated form of influence available to those who understood its principles. Rather than trying to convince people to change their minds through argument or evidence, approaches that often triggered defensive responses, the skilled operator shaped the context within which people formed their judgments in the first place. The technique worked because most people were unaware of how heavily their perceptions were influenced by framing and context. They believed themselves to be objective observers, evaluating information rationally and reaching independent conclusions. In reality, their judgments were systematically shaped by factors they rarely noticed: the order in which information was presented, the emotional state they were in when they received it, the associations and analogies that came to mind, the social environment surrounding the discussion. Cesare Borgia had demonstrated masterful use of this principle during his conquest of the Romagna. Rather than presenting his campaigns as naked aggression or personal ambition, he had framed them as a mission to restore order and justice to territories that had suffered under incompetent local rulers. He publicized the crimes and failures of his targets before moving against them, ensuring that his interventions were seen as necessary corrections rather than unprovoked attacks. When he captured Imola, he did not simply occupy the city and impose his rule. Instead, he conducted a public investigation of the previous lord's administration, documenting instances of corruption, oppression, and mismanagement. He held trials for officials who had abused their positions, redistributed confiscated wealth to those who had been wronged, and implemented reforms that addressed the most pressing grievances of the population. By the time he formally assumed control, many citizens viewed him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The power of this approach lay in its subtlety. People who might have resisted a straightforward conquest found themselves supporting what appeared to be a restoration of justice. The same actions that could have been interpreted as tyrannical were instead seen as necessary and beneficial. The framework Cesare had created shaped perceptions so effectively that opposition seemed not just futile, but morally questionable. This principle operated at every level of human interaction. In the workshops of Florence, Machiavelli had observed how successful merchants managed their customers' perceptions of value and quality. Rather than simply stating the merits of their goods, they created experiences that led customers to discover those merits for themselves. They displayed their finest pieces in settings that enhanced their beauty. They told stories that connected their products to prestigious users or important occasions. They structured their presentations so that customers felt they were making independent judgments while actually being guided toward predetermined conclusions. The application of this truth required deep understanding of human psychology and careful attention to detail. Different audiences required different approaches, and what worked with one group might backfire with another. The key was identifying the existing beliefs, values, and concerns of the target audience and, then, crafting presentations that aligned with those predispositions rather than challenging them directly. Consider how Ferdinand of Aragon had managed to transform his war against the Moors from a political campaign into a religious crusade. Rather than asking his subjects to support him in expanding his territorial holdings, a request that might have generated resistance or indifference, he framed the conflict as a divine mission to reclaim Christian lands from infidel occupation. This reframing transformed the costs of war into opportunities for spiritual merit and made opposition seem not just unpatriotic but heretical. The transformation was achieved through careful attention to symbolism, rhetoric, and timing. Ferdinand's proclamations emphasized religious rather than political goals. His military camps featured prominent displays of Christian symbols. His victories were celebrated as triumphs of faith rather than mere military achievements. Captured territories were immediately marked with churches and crosses, making the religious transformation visible and permanent. The genius of this approach was that it made Ferdinand's personal ambitions appear to be secondary to higher purposes. Subjects who might have questioned their obligation to die for their king's territorial expansion found themselves eager to sacrifice for God's cause. The same military campaigns that could have been seen as costly adventures were instead viewed as sacred duties. But, the most sophisticated practitioners understood that controlling perception required more than just clever framing. It demanded genuine substance behind the appearance. Audiences were not completely naive, and attempts to create impressions that were fundamentally at odds with reality would eventually be exposed. The most effective approach was to identify genuine positive qualities or beneficial aspects of one's position and, then, present them in the most favorable possible light. The fifth truth, the paradox of virtue and power. The letter arrived at dawn, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard travel. Duke Francesco Sforza broke the seal and read the contents with growing amazement. The Republic of Venice, longtime enemy of Milan, was offering not just peace but an active alliance against the growing threat of French intervention in Italian affairs. The terms were generous, the timing perfect, and the strategic logic compelling. There was only one problem: accepting the offer would require breaking solemn oaths he had made to his current allies. As Sforza weighed his options in the privacy of his study, he confronted what Machiavelli would later identify as the fifth fundamental truth about power: conventional virtue and effective leadership existed in permanent tension with each other. The qualities that made a man admirable in private life, honesty, loyalty, consistency, mercy, could become dangerous liabilities when exercised without regard for circumstances in the realm of statecraft. This was not a simple rejection of morality in favor of cynical pragmatism. Machiavelli understood that virtues were generally beneficial and that societies functioned better when most people adhered to ethical principles most of the time. But he also recognized that leadership in a complex world required the ability to act decisively in situations where all available choices involved some compromise of ideal virtue. The Duke's dilemma illustrated this paradox perfectly. His existing allies had not betrayed him, and honoring his commitments to them would be the conventionally virtuous choice. But circumstances had changed since those commitments were made. The French threat was more immediate and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. His current allies lacked the resources to provide effective assistance against such a formidable enemy. Continuing to honor agreements that no longer served their original purposes would likely result in the destruction of his duchy and the suffering of his subjects. From this perspective, the virtuous choice was clear: he should prioritize the welfare of the people under his protection over abstract principles of promise-keeping. The greatest loyalty he owed was not to foreign princes who happened to be his current allies, but to the citizens of Milan who depended on his judgment and protection. Breaking faith with his allies in order to preserve his state could be seen as a higher form of virtue than maintaining formal agreements that would lead to disaster. Yet this reasoning could easily become a slippery slope toward complete amorality. If circumstances could justify breaking any commitment, then no agreement would ever be truly binding, and the entire fabric of international relations would dissolve into chaos. The challenge was determining when circumstances truly warranted departure from conventional virtue and when they merely provided convenient excuses for self-serving behavior. Machiavelli's insight was that effective leaders needed to develop a more sophisticated understanding of virtue than was available to private individuals. Rather than following rigid rules regardless of consequences, they needed to cultivate practical wisdom that allowed them to identify the true moral requirements of specific situations. Sometimes this would align with conventional virtue, but sometimes it would require actions that appeared vice-like on the surface but served virtuous ends. The key distinction was between virtue as adherence to abstract principles and virtue as achievement of good outcomes for those one was responsible to protect. A prince who allowed his state to be destroyed because he refused to break a promise might feel personally pure, but he would have failed in his fundamental duty to his subjects. A prince who broke promises strategically in order to preserve his state and protect his people might appear dishonorable, but he would have fulfilled his most important moral obligations. This principle had profound implications for how effective leaders approached decision-making. They could not afford the luxury of simple moral frameworks that worked well for private individuals. Instead, they needed to develop the ability to think several moves ahead, considering not just the immediate moral implications of their choices but the long-term consequences for everyone affected by their decisions. Consider the example of Pope Julius II, who had systematically broken numerous agreements in his campaign to restore papal temporal authority. His critics condemned him as faithless and opportunistic, pointing to his willingness to ally with former enemies and abandon former friends as circumstances dictated. Yet his strategic flexibility had enabled him to drive foreign armies from Italian soil and restore the independence that generations of his predecessors had lost through excessive consistency. Julius understood that the conventional virtue of promise-keeping, while admirable in principle, could become a strategic weakness when dealing with adversaries who felt no similar constraints. Foreign powers had repeatedly exploited the reliability of Italian leaders, making agreements they never intended to honor while counting on Italian adherence to those same agreements. Only by matching his enemy's strategic flexibility had Julius been able to outmaneuver them. The psychological dimension of this truth was equally important. Leaders who insisted on perfect virtue in all circumstances often found themselves paralyzed when facing complex situations where every choice involved some moral cost. They would delay decisions while searching for options that met all their ethical requirements, only to discover that such options rarely existed in the real world. By the time they acted, if they acted at all, the opportunity for effective intervention had often passed. Conversely, leaders who understood the contextual nature of virtue could act more decisively and effectively. They approached moral questions not as abstract philosophical problems but as practical challenges requiring careful judgment about competing obligations and probable outcomes. This allowed them to make difficult choices while maintaining clear ethical foundations. The crucial insight was that true virtue in leadership required the courage to accept moral responsibility for imperfect choices rather than seeking moral purity through inaction. The leader who refused to make difficult decisions did not avoid moral culpability, he simply transferred that responsibility to circumstances, which were unlikely to produce better outcomes than thoughtful human judgment. The sixth truth, the ecology of loyalty. In the torchlit cellars beneath the Castello Sforzesco, Duke Ludovico gathered with his most trusted advisors to discuss intelligence that had arrived from his network of informants in the French court. King Louis XII was planning a campaign to reclaim Milan, viewing Ludovico's rule as illegitimate usurpation. The Duke's advisors offered various responses, some counseled immediate military preparation, others suggested diplomatic overtures, still others recommended seeking allies among Louis's enemies. But Ludovico understood that his greatest vulnerability lay not in military weakness or diplomatic isolation. His most pressing danger came from within his own court, where loyalty was a complex ecosystem that required constant tending and could collapse with stunning suddenness if not properly maintained. This represented the sixth fundamental truth that Machiavelli had discovered: loyalty was not a simple binary state where people were either faithful or treacherous. Instead, it was a dynamic system of relationships, incentives, and circumstances that could be strengthened or weakened by specific actions and policies. Understanding and managing this ecosystem was essential for any leader who hoped to maintain power over time. The conventional approach to loyalty was to treat it as an inherent character trait possessed by some people and lacking in others. Good leaders, according to this view, were those skilled at identifying naturally loyal individuals and promoting them to positions of trust. Bad leaders were those who misjudged character and placed faith in inherently untrustworthy people. Machiavelli recognized that while individual character mattered, it was far less important than most leaders believed. Even naturally loyal people could be driven to betrayal if their circumstances became desperate enough or if the incentives facing them changed dramatically. Conversely, people with questionable character could be made reliable through careful management of their interests and options. The key insight was that loyalty was primarily a function of rational calculation rather than emotional attachment. People remained faithful as long as they believed that their interests were better served by loyalty than by betrayal. When that calculation shifted, whether due to changing circumstances, better offers from rivals, or deteriorating relationships with their current leader, even the most seemingly devoted followers might switch sides. This understanding led to a sophisticated approach to loyalty management that went far beyond simple reward and punishment. Effective leaders worked to ensure that betrayal was not just disadvantageous but practically impossible. They created redundant systems of surveillance so that treachery would be detected quickly. They structured their organizations so that no single individual or small group could cause decisive damage through defection. They maintained multiple sources of key capabilities so that the loss of any particular follower would not be catastrophic. Equally important was the proactive cultivation of conditions that made loyalty profitable and satisfying. This meant not just providing material rewards for faithful service, but creating opportunities for followers to advance their own interests through supporting their leader's agenda. The most secure relationships were those where both parties benefited from continued cooperation and both would suffer from breakdown of the relationship. Duke Ludovico's situation provided a perfect case study in both the fragility and the potential strength of loyalty systems. His rule was relatively recent, having been established through a coup against his nephew's regency. This meant that many of his courtiers had personal relationships and loyalties that predated his own rise to power. Some had supported him enthusiastically during his takeover, but others had acquiesced reluctantly or remained neutral until his victory was assured. The approaching French threat would test these relationships in ways that peaceful times could not. Courtiers would have to decide whether to stand with Ludovico against overwhelming odds or seek accommodation with the likely victors. Those who had already committed themselves deeply to his cause might calculate that they had no choice but to support him to the end. But others might determine that their best chance for survival lay in facilitating the French conquest. Ludovico's response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of loyalty dynamics. Rather than simply demanding declarations of support or making general appeals to honor and duty, he worked systematically to alter the calculus facing each of his key followers. He provided some with additional lands and revenues, making defection more costly for them personally. He arranged marriages between his supporters' families, creating networks of mutual obligation. He shared intelligence about French plans to eliminate unreliable Italian nobles, making cooperation with the invaders appear more dangerous. At the same time, he worked to limit his followers' options for betrayal. He rotated commanders among different military units, preventing any single leader from developing personal loyalty within particular formations. He established multiple channels of communication and intelligence, making it difficult for potential traitors to coordinate their activities. He created incentive structures that rewarded those who reported suspicious behavior, making treachery both more risky and less likely to succeed. The psychological dimension was equally sophisticated. Ludovico understood that loyalty was strengthened by shared experience and mutual dependence. He involved his key followers in planning sessions, making them participants in decision-making rather than merely recipients of orders. He shared risks with them, participating personally in dangerous activities rather than sending others into hazards he would not face himself. He created rituals and ceremonies that reinforced their collective identity and common purposes. Perhaps most importantly, he worked to ensure that his followers understood the logic behind his decisions and felt confident in his competence and judgment. Loyalty based purely on personal affection or abstract duty was fragile, but loyalty based on rational assessment of a leader's capabilities was more durable. People were more likely to remain faithful to leaders they believed would ultimately prevail than to those they suspected were doomed to failure. This approach required constant attention and adjustment. The loyalty ecosystem was dynamic, responding to changing circumstances, new information, and evolving relationships. What worked in one situation might prove counterproductive in another. Successful leaders developed sensitivity to these shifts and made continuous small adjustments to maintain the overall health of their loyalty networks. The ultimate test came during crises, when the costs and risks of loyalty increased dramatically. Leaders who had built robust loyalty ecosystems found that their followers remained faithful even under extreme pressure. Those who had relied on simple reward and punishment systems or assumed that loyalty was automatic discovered how quickly their support could evaporate when circumstances changed. Part 3, The Mastery of Strategic Thinking. The seventh truth, the necessity of strategic patience. The messenger's face was grim as he delivered his report to Pope Julius II in the papal apartments. French forces under Marshal Trivulzio had achieved another decisive victory, this time routing the papal armies near Ravenna. The Holy League's prospects looked increasingly desperate, and several allied commanders were quietly suggesting that negotiation might be preferable to continued resistance. Yet Julius, despite being in his 70th year and facing what appeared to be imminent defeat, remained committed to his long-term strategy of expelling all foreign powers from Italian soil. This scene illustrated what Machiavelli would identify as the seventh fundamental truth about effective leadership: the absolute necessity of strategic patience. In a world where immediate pressures and urgent crises constantly demanded attention, the ability to maintain focus on long-term objectives often distinguished successful leaders from those who achieved temporary victories but ultimate failure. The conventional approach to leadership emphasized decisive action and rapid response to changing circumstances. Leaders were expected to solve problems quickly, adapt immediately to new situations, and demonstrate their competence through visible activity. This perspective treated patience as a form of weakness or indecision, something that effective leaders should avoid in favor of bold and immediate action. Machiavelli recognized that while rapid response was sometimes necessary, the most important strategic goals usually required sustained effort over extended periods. The leader who focused exclusively on short-term results would find himself constantly reactive, addressing symptoms rather than underlying causes, achieving tactical successes that contributed to strategic failures. Pope Julius's situation demonstrated both the costs and benefits of strategic patience. His immediate military position was precarious, and conventional wisdom suggested that he should seek whatever terms he could obtain from his stronger enemies. Yet Julius understood that accepting unfavorable peace terms would merely postpone rather than resolve the fundamental problem of foreign domination. The French and Spanish would use any breathing space to consolidate their positions and prepare for future campaigns. Better to continue the struggle when he still retained some capacity for resistance than to surrender and hope for more favorable circumstances later. This calculation required extraordinary psychological strength. Strategic patience demanded the ability to endure immediate suffering for the sake of future gains that might never materialize. It required confidence in one's analysis when current evidence seemed to contradict one's strategy. Most difficult of all, it required the ability to explain and justify one's approach to followers who were experiencing present hardships and questioning whether the ultimate goals were worth the current costs. The Duke of Venice, Andrea Gritti, had demonstrated this principle during the War of the League of Cambrai, when virtually all of Europe had combined against the Venetian Republic. Rather than seeking immediate accommodation with his enemies, Gritti had methodically worked to split the coalition opposing him, understanding that his opponent's unity was inherently unstable. While his city endured siege and his territories were overrun, he patiently negotiated with individual members of the League, exploiting their conflicting interests and long-term rivalries. The strategy had required years to bear fruit, during which Venice suffered enormous costs and appeared to be facing annihilation. Critics within the city had repeatedly called for compromise, arguing that Gritti's approach was leading to unnecessary destruction. Yet when the coalition finally began to fracture, as Gritti had predicted, Venice was positioned to recover not just its independence but much of its former territory and influence. The key insight was that strategic patience was not passive waiting but active preparation for favorable future circumstances. While maintaining focus on long-term goals, effective leaders used present difficulties as opportunities to strengthen their foundations, develop new capabilities, and position themselves to capitalize on eventual changes in the strategic environment. This required sophisticated judgment about timing and priorities. Strategic patience did not mean ignoring immediate threats or refusing to adapt to changing circumstances. Instead, it meant distinguishing between tactical adjustments that supported long-term objectives and diversions that would undermine them. The skilled leader would yield on secondary issues while remaining firm on fundamental goals, would accept temporary setbacks while working systematically toward ultimate victory. Consider the example of Ferdinand of Aragon's approach to the conquest of Naples. Rather than launching immediate military campaigns that would have alerted his enemies and triggered defensive coalitions, Ferdinand spent years building the political and diplomatic foundations for his eventual move. He cultivated relationships with Neapolitan nobles who were dissatisfied with current rule. He negotiated agreements with potential allies who might support his claims. He developed intelligence networks that would provide crucial information when military action finally began. When Ferdinand did move against Naples, his campaign succeeded rapidly because the groundwork had been laid over many years. What appeared to observers as sudden, brilliant success was actually the culmination of patient, methodical preparation. The military action was merely the final phase of a strategy that had been developing for decades. The psychological challenges of strategic patience were enormous. Leaders who adopted this approach faced constant pressure from followers who wanted immediate results and critics who interpreted patience as weakness or indecision. They had to maintain confidence in their analysis despite contrary evidence and changing circumstances. Most difficult of all, they had to accept that they might not live to see their strategies come to fruition, that they might be working for benefits that would accrue to their successors rather than themselves. Yet the alternatives were worse. Leaders who focused exclusively on short-term results found themselves trapped in cycles of crisis management, never able to address underlying problems because they were constantly responding to immediate symptoms. They achieved tactical victories that contributed to strategic defeats, won individual battles while losing larger wars. The development of strategic patience required deliberate cultivation of certain mental habits and disciplines. Leaders needed to regularly step back from immediate pressures and assess their positions from broader perspectives. They needed to develop clear criteria for distinguishing between essential objectives and secondary goals. They needed to create systems for measuring progress toward long-term objectives even when short-term indicators were discouraging. Most importantly, they needed to develop the intellectual honesty to reassess their strategies when circumstances changed fundamentally, distinguishing between temporary setbacks that called for perseverance and genuine strategic failures that required new approaches. The eighth truth, the ultimate recognition, power's true nature. In the final months of 1513, as winter settled over the hills surrounding Florence, Machiavelli put down his pen and surveyed the manuscript that would eventually become The Prince. The work represented more than political analysis or practical advice for rulers. It embodied his deepest insights into the fundamental nature of human existence and social organization. And, at its core lay the eighth and most profound truth he had discovered: power was not a tool that could be picked up and set aside at will, but an environment that transformed all who entered it, creating its own logic and imposing its own requirements. This final truth synthesized and transcended all the others. The leader who truly understood power's nature recognized that it was neither inherently good nor inherently evil, but rather a force that operated according to its own laws, indifferent to human preferences about how it should work. Like fire or water, power could be beneficial or destructive depending on how it was channeled and controlled, but it could never be eliminated from human affairs or made to conform to idealized visions of how it ought to function. The recognition began with understanding that power was not simply the ability to command obedience or control resources. At its deepest level, power was the capacity to shape reality according to one's will, to determine not just what people did, but what they thought possible, what they considered legitimate, what they perceived as inevitable. This meant that those who wielded power effectively were not merely giving orders but creating the conceptual frameworks within which others understood their options and obligations. Consider how the Roman Empire had maintained control over vast territories and diverse populations not primarily through military force, though force was always available as a background threat, but through the creation of a comprehensive vision of civilization that made Roman rule appear natural and beneficial. Subject peoples adopted Roman legal systems, architectural styles, educational methods, and cultural practices not because they were forced to do so, but because Roman civilization offered attractive alternatives to their existing ways of life. The genius of this approach was that it made resistance not just dangerous but seemingly pointless. People who had internalized Roman assumptions about law, governance, and social organization found it difficult to imagine viable alternatives. The empire's power lay not in its legions, though they were formidable, but in its capacity to shape the intellectual and cultural environment within which political questions were considered. This deeper understanding of power's nature explained why many apparently successful rulers ultimately failed while others with seemingly weaker positions managed to endure and prosper. Those who understood power as mere command and control found themselves constantly struggling against resistance, rebellion, and subversion. They achieved temporary compliance through threats and rewards, but never created the kind of genuine authority that made their rule seem legitimate and natural. By contrast, those who understood power's deeper nature worked to create conditions where their authority appeared to flow from sources beyond their personal will. They embedded their rule within religious frameworks, legal traditions, cultural practices, or historical narratives that made opposition seem not just dangerous but wrong or unthinkable. They transformed themselves from mere wielders of power into embodiments of principles that their subjects already accepted as valid and important. This transformation was visible in the career of Augustus Caesar, who had inherited a Roman republic torn by civil war and faction but managed to create an imperial system that endured for centuries. His genius lay not in his military victories or administrative reforms, though both were significant, but in his ability to present the transformation of the republic into an empire as a restoration rather than a revolution. Augustus retained republican institutions and terminology while systematically concentrating real power in his own hands. He presented himself not as a monarch but as the first citizen of a restored republic, accepting extraordinary powers reluctantly and temporarily to address emergency situations that somehow never quite ended. By the time his contemporaries recognized the permanent nature of the changes he had implemented, the new system had become so embedded in Roman institutions and expectations that reverting to the old republic seemed both impossible and undesirable. The psychological dimension of this truth was particularly profound. Those who wielded significant power for extended periods found that it changed not just their external circumstances but their internal landscape. The constant need to make decisions that affected others' lives, to maintain vigilance against threats, to project confidence even in uncertain situations, all of this gradually transformed their personalities and perceptions. Successful rulers often became isolated from ordinary human experience, surrounded by people who told them what they wanted to hear and insulated from the direct consequences of their decisions. They began to see themselves as fundamentally different from their subjects, possessed of special insights and responsibilities that set them apart from common humanity. This transformation was not necessarily corruption or moral failure, it was a predictable response to the unique pressures and opportunities that power created. The challenge was maintaining enough self-awareness to recognize these changes and enough wisdom to compensate for their potentially distorting effects. The ruler who lost touch with how ordinary people lived and thought would gradually lose the ability to understand and respond to their needs and concerns. The ruler who began to believe his own propaganda about his special nature would lose the skeptical judgment that effective decision-making required. Yet complete resistance to power's transformative effects was neither possible nor entirely desirable. Some degree of psychological separation from ordinary concerns was necessary for making difficult decisions that served long-term interests rather than immediate preferences. Some degree of confidence and authority was essential for inspiring the kind of respect and cooperation that effective governance required. The art lay in managing the transformation consciously rather than being unconsciously shaped by it. This required deliberate practices designed to maintain perspective, regular consultation with trusted advisors who would speak honestly about problems and failures, systematic gathering of information from sources beyond the official hierarchy, periodic reassessment of fundamental assumptions and strategies. Most importantly, it required what Machiavelli called virtù, not conventional virtue in the sense of adherence to moral rules, but rather the combination of skills, judgment, and character traits that enabled effective action in complex and changing circumstances. This included practical capabilities like strategic thinking and tactical skill, but also psychological qualities like courage, resilience, and the ability to learn from failure. The leader who possessed true virtù understood that power was both an enormous opportunity and a constant danger. It offered the chance to achieve great things, to shape events according to one's vision, to leave lasting marks on history. But it also created temptations toward excess, corruption, and delusion. It attracted enemies and rivals who would exploit any weakness or mistake. It demanded constant vigilance and continuous adaptation to changing circumstances. As Machiavelli concluded his great work, he understood that he had not written a simple manual for aspiring rulers but rather an analysis of the human condition itself. Power in its various forms was present in all human relationships and institutions. The same principles that governed the behavior of princes applied, with appropriate modifications, to merchants managing their businesses, soldiers leading their units, fathers governing their families. The ultimate recognition was that understanding power's true nature was essential for anyone who hoped to navigate successfully through a world where human beings lived together in complex social organizations. Whether one sought to wield power effectively, resist it intelligently, or simply survive in its presence, the first requirement was to see it clearly, without romantic illusions about how it ought to work and without cynical assumptions about its inevitable effects. Power was neither humanity's salvation nor its curse, but rather one of the fundamental forces that shaped human existence. Like gravity or entropy, it operated according to discoverable laws that could be understood and worked with, but never abolished or fundamentally altered. The wise person learned these laws and used them to achieve worthy ends. The fool either ignored them and suffered the consequences or allowed them to corrupt him into pursuing unworthy ends. In the flickering candlelight of his study, surrounded by the manuscripts and letters that documented the rise and fall of republics and kingdoms, Machiavelli understood that he had captured something eternal about the human experience. The specific examples he had analyzed would pass into history, the particular rulers he had observed would be forgotten by all but scholars, but the truths he had discovered would remain relevant as long as human beings lived together in organized societies. The 8 cold-blooded truths formed a coherent vision of how reality actually worked, as opposed to how people wished it worked or imagined it should work. They provided a foundation for clear thinking about complex problems, effective action in difficult circumstances, and honest assessment of success and failure. Most importantly, they offered the possibility of approaching power relationships with neither naive optimism nor despairing cynicism, but with the kind of informed realism that made wise action possible. For in the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was that human affairs, despite their complexity and unpredictability, were not purely random or chaotic. They operated according to patterns that could be studied, understood, and influenced by those with sufficient intelligence and courage to see them clearly. The 8 truths were not the end of wisdom but, rather the beginning, the foundation upon which more sophisticated understanding could be built by those who had learned to think clearly about power and its effects on human behavior. The winter wind howled through the streets of Florence as Machiavelli sealed his manuscript, knowing that he had created something that would outlive both him and the city that had shaped his thinking. In capturing the eternal principles that governed human power relationships, he had provided future generations with tools for understanding their own circumstances and making their own difficult choices. Whether they would use these tools wisely remained to be seen, but at least they would have the opportunity to think clearly about what they were actually facing rather than what they imagined they ought to be facing. And, in a world where clear thinking was often the difference between success and failure, between survival and destruction, between achieving one's goals and seeing them collapse into ruin, that opportunity might prove to be the most valuable gift of all.